Hi, everybody. This is Jeff, and in this recording, I'm going to be presenting to you a presentation that I gave in 2021 at the Linux Foundation's Open Source Summit. This presentation was on the interview environment, creating an inclusive, diverse, equitable, and aware interview for traditional and non-traditional candidates. So my talk began with this slide by Craig Fenton, who at the time was the Director of Strategy and Operations at Google. And the gist of this slide was that of all of the hundreds of interviews that he did, the most successful candidates had average grades, didn't go to the best schools, had great street smarts, were sort of had your non-traditional skill sets, whereas a lot of the less successful candidates were great interviewers, went to the best schools, had straight A's. And so I took this and I presented the slide so that to set the stage that some non-traditional candidates might be the right fit for the job, whereas the people that ace the interviews and have the great resumes might not be the best for the job. Then I continued with what's going well in the interview process. One positive change in the interview process is the holistic approach to hiring. So rather than thinking about individuals as discrete units on a team, reframing the question to how do I approach creating my dream team, right? What is my holistic what is the collective overview of what a dream team looks like? Where and how do I source top talent? Right? When it comes to sourcing talent, there are a number of inclusive inbound recruiting efforts, like sourcing from underrepresented groups, and inclusive outbound recruiting efforts, like how do I source from underrepresented groups, and inbound recruiting efforts, like creating gender-neutral job descriptions and removing barrier words and phrases, like dominant for men and understanding for women. There's also a narrative shift from screening people out, to screening people in to help develop an inclusive culture. One way to do this is recruiters can gather as much data as possible during phone calls to uncover attributes not listed on resumes. Another question to ask is, where do I build networks, right? Expand referral networks to incorporate more diverse groups, because the majority of employees refer people from their own networks, their in-groups. So expand those networks to include out-groups, and you'll, just by virtue of that, develop a more inclusive environment. And then ask yourself the key question, how do you assess talent? How do I assess talent? Do I just look for the hard skills? Do I look for the soft skills that are on the interview packet? Or am I creating efforts? Am I including efforts to look for what I call attitude and aptitude? So I personally, when I hire candidates, I look for two qualities: attitude and aptitude. There are also a growing number of post-hire inclusion, diversity, equity, and awareness initiatives. After a candidate has been hired into the company, many companies nowadays have equity and inclusion training across multiple domains. Generally, they focus on bias awareness and elimination, battling biased systems to ensure colleagues are respected, expected, and reflected, diversifying working networks, creating environments of psychological safety and allyship. There's professional development initiatives internally, like how do you make sure there's equitable access to professional development for everybody? And then performance management as well. How do you make sure that bias doesn't influence who you rate as a success? How do you define success? How can you ensure people are managed fairly? And how do you manage exits fairly and gracefully? And finally, another post-hire idea initiative is promotions. How do you make sure there is equity and equality in the promotion process? What do you look for when you want to promote somebody? How do you ensure that there are opportunities for underrepresented groups to advance into leadership? Right? All of these are very positive post-hire initiatives for inclusion, diversity, equity, and awareness. So now let's talk about the standard hiring template. Okay, we talked about post-hire initiatives, pre-hire initiatives. Now let's focus on the interview process itself, the moment in between pre and post-hire. The standard interview template typically includes a panel that includes the hiring manager, a representative from HR or recruiting, a cross-functional partner, and technical and cultural assessors. This is typically what you see. And these assessors, these participants, are usually chosen by availability and subject matter expertise, be that subject matter a domain expertise or cultural expertise. And there are some problems with this standard template, right? One is inconsistency. If you choose anyone who's available, then the interviewers can change, and assessing people consistently becomes impossible, right? Questions can change, interpretations of responses can change, individual biases can change. There's also fatigue and reluctance. So your go-tos, if you're going to have like the same people on an interview panel all the time, they're requested over and over, they're going to encounter fatigue, which will eventually lead to reluctance. People just don't want to go onto interview panels anymore because it's too time-consuming, it's too draining, it takes up a lot of resources. So you start to encounter reluctance. These are some problems with the standard. The interview itself can also be uncomfortable for the candidates, right? This is a broad statement, but in summation, there is increased pressure to conform to assumed or perceived interviewer expectations by the interviewee, right? This is typical across interviews. We can see this manifested in dress. So, for example, women electing not to wear ethnic or natural hairstyles. In clothing, for example, clothing that hides or de-emphasizes natural body shapes. And in speech, and this is most frequently manifested as code switching. There's also in-group and out-group bias. So making the in-group, out-group, us versus them distinction is an automatic process that happens within seconds of meeting somebody. It's just a part of our fast system. There's like a fast and a slow system, a hot and a cold system, some authors call it. But these two systems within our cognition that make immediate decisions or that slow down and can think about a response, right? But the in-group, out-group distinction is automatic, and it happens within seconds of meeting somebody. In-group and out-group bias leads to relative favoritism compared to out-group members. In-group bias, rather, leads to relative favoritism. Again, this is just something that happens naturally. If somebody's in your in-group, you are naturally more favorable towards them. And by favoring in-group members, we tend to grant them a measure of trust and regard them more positively. And microaggressions can be subtle and damaging in the interview and post-interview processes, right? So during the interview, microaggressions might manifest as questions like, where are you really from? Oh, you're so articulate. I got this job by working my way up, with the assumption that others may not have, right? Are you worried about living in that part of town? Or using terminology or slang not from your own culture? That one happens a lot. That's during the interview. Post-interview, these can manifest as mistaken identity, using the word qualified when describing candidates of color only, right? Or using phrasing like lowering the bar or lowering our standards. So how do we interrupt bias in the interview? Okay. First, creating an inclusive panelist pool, right? It is important to have buy-in from your interviewers and have a consistent role-based pool. So how do you do this? First, you have an opt-in method for people to share their subject matter expertise, right? Allow people to opt in to interviews. If you set context regarding role-based commitments and rotations, then you have a better chance of keeping the same interviewers on the panel for the role. Okay, so remember, consistent role-based pools of interviewers. And you can set context, for example, by letting an interviewer know that they have to be just as committed to a role with 7 candidates as a role with 2 candidates. But setting those expectations and context is very important. To reduce fatigue, panelists can be rotated per role, not just per candidate or based on a number of interviews they've done. We typically see that as well, right? Okay, Mr. Smith has done 7 interviews. He's at the end of his rotation. Let's call in Mrs. Smith. Then we talked about a couple slides back, inconsistency in interpretations, questions, etc. So we want to make sure that the interviewers are consistent for the role. And then having a pool of diverse interviewers can help the hiring manager develop an inclusive panel that remains consistent and reduces bias. So it's important to create a diverse interview panel. It's crucial when you're considering creating an inclusive panelist pool that interviewers should be representative of the organization as often as possible, and should be as representative of the candidate as well. So it should be representative of the diversity of the organization as often as possible, and representative and be representative of the candidate as often as possible. To ensure candidates are evaluated fairly, they should be asked the same questions. So you should standardize questions, discussions, and evaluations. A lot of companies are getting a lot better at this with interview packets that they deliver interviewers that have a standardized set of questions, a standardized evaluation template. These are great. If your company or if your organization doesn't have one of those, I highly recommend you look at standardizing your interview templates. It's important that you work with the hiring manager, the team, or the subject matter expert to determine the questions that should be asked to assess the skill. Conversations should be open but not aimless, right? So it's okay to let the conversation roam a little bit, but it's important to keep it on track in order to standardize and make sure that every candidate has a fair and equitable assessment. Sometimes extemporaneous conversation is okay, but resist the temptation to digress, right? This is same. Conversation should be open but not aimless. Dig into the specific questions or conversations to get the information you need to assess the candidate, and try not to go on sort of like wild tangents if at all possible. It's important to create interview templates that contain standard questions and formats. A standard interview format could be one like SAIL, which is an acronym for situation, action, impact, and learning. So the situation could be, what's the background? What's the problem that if you're asking an interviewer, if you're an interviewer and you're asking a candidate what was a problem you worked on, for example, right? That's a very common question. Give me a time you had to solve a problem. You could use a standardized template for that. So you can use SAIL. What's the situation? Describe the background, describe the problem you needed to be solved. What was the action you took? What was your role? What was the impact? What were the results? What impact did the results have? And finally, learning. What did you take away from the experience? If you standardize the questions in a format like that, it doesn't have to be that exact format, but if you use that format or any format to standardize your questions, it leads to a much better candidate experience because it's a little bit more organized, but also it makes evaluation much, much easier. You should also have, and speaking of evaluation, you should also have processes to evaluate responses. For example, were responses generally negative or positive? Did the candidate avoid difficult questions or situations or embrace them and own them? Ensure these rubrics are standardized. And finally, standardized behavioral ratings. So we see a lot of, particularly in candidate evaluations, post-interview evaluations, people tend to see a lot of 1 to 5 scales, right? A lot of these 1 to 5 scales are in the form of 1 is a strong no, 5 is a strong yes. But that really doesn't give you a lot of information, right? Essentially, you want to make those behaviorally anchored ratings. So if you're assessing a behavior, for example, did this individual take ownership of a difficult situation, right? Your 1 to 5 scale could be always demonstrated at 5 and never demonstrated at 1, right? And these help give you a little bit more detail and provide a few more talking points. And finally, iterate on the conventional framework, right? Everyone has experienced interviews where they receive the same questions over and over and over from different people. Changing the standard interview convention can help keep things fresh, interesting, and insightful. I'll give you a couple examples. Share questions with candidates ahead of time and ask them to submit responses prior to the interview, right? This is a sort of behavioro-technical assessment, and it can serve multiple purposes. One, it tests preparedness. Two, it can encourage conversation and creativity in the evaluation process rather than the time-crunched interview itself. Particularly, this is interesting in a whiteboard exam, right? So if you're a technical person, a developer, an engineer, all of us have had whiteboard tests where we actually have to go up to a whiteboard and write some code or solve a problem or do an algorithm. But if you provide that information, for example, the day before as like a homework assignment, and then you come in and then the candidate comes in with a prepared answer, you give them a little bit of time, it opens up the conversation so that you can really dig into the thought process behind it rather than, spending time evaluating it on the spot, etc. On the spot can sometimes be helpful, but in today's day and age, it's rarely a realistic explanation. And if somebody goes and Stack Overflows an answer, then during the evaluation, when you're talking about it the next day, you're going to be able to spot that pretty fast. And finally, this is one that I really like. The interviewer can ask the candidate to teach them something they're an expert in, right? It's a task-based communications evaluation. That could be anything, right? Teach me this technical thing. Teach me how to play baseball. Teach me, how to crochet, something that you're interested in. It could be anything. Essentially, what you're trying to gather from this is how do you communicate a concept to somebody that's unfamiliar with that concept? A really strong skill. Games are a great way to evaluate candidates, particularly in a non-traditional setting, right? So there are a lot of online games that you can play together, that people can play together, that are like problem-solving games, puzzle games, etc. I like to include my entire team in the interview process. And if my team is so big that I'm not able to schedule a one-on-one interview with each one of my teammates, what I'll do is I'll put a game together and schedule a lot of people to play together with a candidate. This allows not only my team, but myself to observe this individual's communication style, how they interact with a team, how they handle pressure, how do they react under stress, and it lets my team have a little bit of room to evaluate the candidate themselves, because potentially this is a person they're going to work with. So again, evaluation, iteration, experimentation, right? In addition to the standard debrief for an interview, you want to evaluate whether the process worked, right? So evaluate, iterate, experiment. Evaluate whether the process worked. Did this new framework of playing a game, maybe giving somebody a homework assignment and coming in, screening candidates differently, maybe approaching the interview with a different method, did it work? Did it help you find a quality candidate? Were you able to make better decisions, right? What areas of the process were most impactful? Where should more time be devoted? Speak with the new hire who went through the process. Ask them for feedback, right? And then talk with the panel participants for feedback. Was the experience positive? Was it beneficial? Did it make a difference? Sometimes it will, sometimes it won't. But that's why you evaluate, iterate, and experiment. So this improved framework can reduce bias, improve the candidate experience, it can improve the quality of your new hires, and it can create brand ambassadors. So even if the candidate isn't hired, a brand ambassador is somebody who had experienced a deeper emotional connection to the company, right? They will leave saying, wow, that was a really interesting interview. They'll leave wanting more. They'll tell people about it. You create a strong brand ambassador even in the case where they didn't get the job, which is a rare and unique thing and very, very powerful. This was the end of my presentation. I really appreciate you sitting through it. If you have any questions or have any thoughts or feedback on this presentation, again, it was delivered a couple years ago in 2021, but it's now available on my website, jeffstrauss.net. It's available on my YouTube channel. And please leave a comment, leave some feedback. I'd love to hear what you think. Thanks so much.